here today to go through quite possibly one of the toughest things to wrap your head around in microeconomics, and that is elasticity. Okay. So elasticity completely changes the equilibrium we just talked about in the last sections. What elasticity does is that it defines pretty simply how a change in the price of a good is how people react to that, both suppliers and consumers, right? So I'm just going to start here with a kind of a brief definition of elasticity, and it is the response to a price change, right? And how responsive it is, right? So that's what elasticity on the whole means in layman's terms, right? How quickly it's going to respond to a price change. And we're going to look at two types of elasticity. We're going to look at price elasticity of demand and price elasticity of supply. There is more types of elasticity, but for our purposes, we do not need to know those. Okay, so let's look at the formula, and the way they wrote the formula is just a little. I feel like it's a little too complicated. So let's make it less complicated. So pretty simple. The percent change in quantity demanded over the percent change in price. All right. Okay. Which you'll sometimes see the change as delta, right? A kind of a triangle, right? But the Greek letter delta, right? And then likewise down here, it's going to be percent change. You know what? Let's go ahead and start making that change. Percent change in quantity supplied over percent change in price. Okay. So what defines elasticity here? Okay. Well, so basically what's going to happen here is that this percent change is going to change at a certain rate in response to this change. Okay. And technically this number will always be negative, but because of that, we just take the absolute value of it, right? Because quantity, demand, and price are negatively related, right? So one of these will be negative when the other's positive, making the whole thing negative. Okay. So let's look at some examples to maybe understand how what elasticity looks like. So let's say we have a percent change of 1, or excuse me, percent change in price is equal to 1% change, right? So using this number, right, if we look at the percent change of quantity demanded, which I'm going to shorten to QD, let's say this is 0.5. All right. So what that means is that for every percent price change of 1%, that the quantity demanded is changing by less than that. Okay. So what that means is that this is a fairly inflexible good, whatever good we're looking at here, right? So the thing we would call this is inelastic, right? It is not very stretchy. It's not very movable, right? It's not elastic, right? So we would call that inelastic, right? Now, if instead we saw it as 2 over 1, right? That good is elastic, right? It is very responsive to price changes, right? So if the percent change of price is 1, then the percent change of quantity demanded is 2. That means it's very, very responsive, right? That is a massive change, okay? So there's not really math involved, and I don't think they'll ask you too much math here, but what we need to know, and I'm actually going to get rid of these over here just because I think I need to use this space for different stuff. So there are four types of elasticity, or four ranges of elasticity, let's say, right? Um, so I guess there's five. There is five. I apologize. There's five. Um, so the first one, well, the first two we'll do are the ones we've already pointed out. Okay. Oh, that makes sense. So if we see the number greater than one, so if elasticity, which I'm going to mark as E, if elasticity is greater than one, then we have a good that is elastic. Okay, as we saw right here, right, this is 2 over 1, this is 2, this particular good would be elastic, right? Now, if it's less than 1, or let's say if it's between 1 and 0, let's do it like that, then it is inelastic, right? That means that the response to a price change is very slow, right? If elasticity is equal exactly to 1, that means it is what's called unit elastic. Okay, what that means is that the percent change of price and the percent change of quantity demanded move in lockstep, right? Which means that as the percent changes for either of them, the other one goes the same way, right? Really, when the price changes, the quantity demanded goes the exact way. So for here, right, if we have percent change price of 1, then the quantity demanded change would also be 1. If elasticity is equal to 0, right, then that is perfectly inelastic. Okay, so what that means is that if this is at 1 and this is at 0, right, the percent change of quantity demanded is 0, that means that no matter what the price change is, the same amount of that good will be bought. Okay, now obviously this probably doesn't actually exist, but it might. And it's good for our purposes as like an example. And if elasticity equals infinity, right, that is perfectly elastic. Okay, so when the percent change of price is 1 and the percent change of quantity demanded is a bajillion, right, 5 million or whatever, right, that basically means it's perfectly elastic, right, which means that any price change is going to completely change the quantity demanded, um, basically to infinity, right? Um, let me make sure that's right. I need to double check. It's been a while since I've done all this. Um, I don't think it's actually infinity. I think it just does not exist. All right, we'll look at that here in a little bit. Okay, so these are the 5 types of elasticity. All right, and so let's see kind of how that would look on a graph. All right, let me go and erase this real quick. We'll come back to these again in a little bit. Okay, but we're going to look at the demand side of this for right now. Okay, so let's just make a tiny little market here, tiny little curve. Okay, so if we have let's start with unielastic. If we have a unielastic curve, right, so I'm going to notate this as kind of white, right? If we have a unielastic curve, we should have something that looks like this, right? The slope is 1 to 1. And what defines the slope? Well, it's these right here, the change of quantity demanded, which is our x-axis, and our change of price, which is our y-axis, right? So if unielastic is equal to 1 over 1, right, that means that we should see a 1 to 1 change as we go up or down this curve, right? So now let's look at one that is elastic, right? So let's say again it's 2 over 1, right? So that means that our slope is a slope of 2, right? Well, actually, it's the other way, I believe, right? It's been a while since I've taught math. So if it's greater than 1, if it's 2, right, what we're going to see here is a kind of flattening of it. Let's get a different color here. Let's go blue, right? Okay. So what we're going to see is that for every for every 1 unit of price, we're going to shift on the x-axis twice, right? So we're going to see something that looks more like this. Okay, so this is demand for an elastic good, right? This is demand for a unit elastic good, right? So what that means then is that as price changes, right, we see a more rapid change in quantity demanded, right? So let's look at two different prices here, right? Let's pick out. Let's use this price here and this price here. And again, these are just like kind of ethereal examples. Actually, let's use the price where they intersect. I think that's a good one to use, right? Okay, so let's use this price. Let's call this P1. And let's use this price right here, which is P2. Okay, so what we can see here is that they both start right here, right? They both have the same Q1, right? Q1 for both of them, but their Q2 is very different, right? This is the Q2 for a unit elastic demand, and this is a Q2 for a elastic demand. Okay, so what we see here is that the change in quantity demanded from Q1 to Q2 is much smaller for a unit elastic than it is for an elastic good. Okay, and that is what we talk about with the price change, right? If you think about the concept of elasticity, right? Something is very stretchy, something's very moldable or movable, right? So this more elastic curve means that that quantity is more movable as we shift price. Okay. So now let's take a look at an inelastic good. Let's go with yellow, right? So if it's, 0.5 over 1, right? What we see here is that as price changes, right, we're going to see less of a response from this good. Okay. So again, if we use the same example here, right, if we use the same P1 and P2, what we see with our elastic good or inelastic good is that the quantity demand change is much smaller, right? Excuse me, that should be a D. Okay, so this is demand for an elastic good, right? So again, just kind of representing that this is not nearly as fungible as either of these two, right? It is very inelastic, it's very rigid, right? So when you see perfectly inelastic, right, that is an I, essentially. So when the slope is 0, right, that means it just doesn't shift ever, right? And so what we see is a curve that's supposed to be straight, right? Forgive my wonderful, my artistic skills, right? So what that means is that no matter what the price change, the quantity is the same, right? There's literally no change. Whereas with a perfectly inelastic curve, perfectly elastic, apologies, we're going to see it kind of be an exactly horizontal curve, right? Where any price change up or down is going to lead to a complete removal of people buying this good at all, right? So it is completely elastic, which is, again, not really a thing. Neither is perfectly inelastic. They are just kind of the extremes of this. They're not nearly as important as the other three: elastic, inelastic, and unit elastic, right? Those are the important ones, right? So if we use a number chart to kind of summarize all this, right? If we use a number line, right? Let's start it right there. Yeah, let's do that. Okay. So if we see a 0, right, that is perfectly inelastic. Between 0 and 1 is inelastic, right? I know there's like, you do like a open circle here or something, right? Right, to an open circle. Haha, that's pretty good. This is inelastic. 1 exactly is unit elastic. And then from one going forward, which is one going forward, it is elastic. And then somewhere out here at infinity, right, is perfectly elastic. Okay, so that's how it works with demand. Okay, with supply, it's the exact same thing. I'm not going to draw it out, but it's the exact same thing, just flipped, right? So let's talk about price elasticity of demand. Now, what makes a good elastic or inelastic? Well, for demand, there are 4 factors. Okay, so kind of like how we had a bunch of factors that shift demand and supply, we have a bunch of things that impact the elasticity of demand and supply. Okay, so the first one is the availability of substitutes. Okay, so if it has substitutes, what do you think will happen? What do you think will happen to the price elasticity? If you can easily switch from that good to another, right, what do you think it would be? Would it be elastic, inelastic, or uninelastic, right? So if you can switch to a different good quickly, that means that you're going to be very receptive to price changes, right? Both one way or the other. If the price increases, it's going to be much easier for you to switch to the substitute. If price decreases and you're buying the substitute, it's going to be very easy for you to switch back to it, right? So if there are substitutes, it is elastic. And if no close substitutes, it is inelastic. Right. So that is one of the things that affects the price elasticity of demand. All right. The second one is if it is a necessity. Okay. So what is a necessity? Well, necessity is things you have to have. Right. So that one's pretty simple as well. Or not. It's simpler than this. If a necessity, if true, then you're going to be very inelastic, right? Because you need to have that good. So no matter what happens to the price, you have to have it. Likewise, if false, it is elastic. So if it's not a necessity and the price changes, you can move away from it or move to it. Okay. Third one is going to be the market definition. Okay. So when we talk about markets, right, we would be using the market for gasoline, right, which is a little hard to kind of use this. But let's say we took a look at 2 markets. Let's say we use the markets of Coca-Cola, right, the brand Coca-Cola, and the market for soft drinks or sodas. Okay. Now, in the market for Coca-Cola, and we're just comparing these two, right? We're not necessarily saying this is elastic or inelastic on the whole, but if we're looking at the market for Coca-Cola compared to the market for soft drinks, right? Well, if the price change on Coca-Cola, if there's a price change on Coca-Cola, then I can easily switch to another good, right? So if there's a price increase, we have substitutes available, right? So because of this, right, we would call this market pretty elastic, right? Because there's Dr. Pepper, there's Pepsi, there's store brands, right, stuff like that. Okay, but if we're looking at the market for soft drinks, right, there's a lot of people, that's a particular thing they want, right? And the market for soft drinks is not easily replaceable, right? If a price changes in soft drinks, people aren't necessarily going to be like, okay, well, I'm going to go get orange juice, right? That's not necessarily what they're looking for, right? They're looking for soda. They're looking for caffeine and the fizz and the flavor of it, which is very hard to capture from other things. But for Coca-Cola, right? Yeah, it's got a unique taste, but Pepsi's pretty much the same thing, right? Dr. Pepper's pretty much the same thing, right? So the market for soft drinks is much more inelastic. Right? If the price of all soft drinks goes up, right, you're still likely to find people who are going to purchase soft drinks, right? Whereas if the price for Coca-Cola goes up, you will more likely see people move to another soft drink product, right? A substitute. Okay. The final one is the time horizon. Okay, so the ability to adjust to what's happening in a market is heavily dictated by how much time you have. Okay, so if we're talking about the short term, right? Let's say a day, right? Let's say the market prices change in a day. Um, what can you do to change the purchase of that thing? Now, maybe it's not a necessity, right? Maybe it's something that has lots of substitutes. Maybe it's elastic, right? But when we're comparing short term to the long term, right? If it's a short term change in price, right, it is going to be pretty inelastic. It's going to be hard to adjust your consumption that rapidly, right? Likewise, if it's the long term, you can start to plan your life a little bit differently, right? Gas works perfectly on this, right? If gas goes up from $2 a gallon and then tomorrow it's $4 a gallon, right? And you stop at the gas station, you're not gonna just not get gas, right? I have to go to work, I have to go to school, I have to go do this thing, so I'm gonna get this gas right now. But in the long term, if gas stays at $4, maybe I start taking public transportation, right? Maybe I start riding my bike to work, right? Maybe I walk to work, right? So in long term, you are more elastic in terms of changing your demand. Okay. So those are the four things that can change the price elasticity of demand. And again, the elasticity is essentially the slope of the good, but flipped, I think, right? Because it's usually y over x. This is x over y, but it is related to the slope, right? So the flatter it is, the more elastic it is. The more steep it is, the more inelastic it is, right? As we kind of showed here. So let's look then at price elasticity of supply. Let me make sure that's the name of it. Yes. Okay. So let's look at price elasticity of supply and the things that can affect it. And just like we saw with supply and demand shifts in the curve, where demand had 5 things that could shift it and supply only had 4, supply here only has 3 things that can affect the price elasticity of supply, whereas demand has 4. So the first one is going to be ease and entry of exit. Ease of entry and exit into the market. Okay. So what this basically means is, how quickly you can switch to another good, to producing another good, right? So if you're in a market that it's very easy to switch to another business, right? Let's say you're a factory making Oreo cookies, right? And all of a sudden, um, the price of cookies goes way down. It's no longer profitable for you to make Oreo cookies. Well, you are probably fairly, let's not say Oreo cookies because they're kind of unique, right? Let's say you're making Chips Ahoy, right? Well, it might be easy for you to switch to making another type of cookie, right? Um, uh, you know, I don't know what type of cookies are there. Maybe Nutter Butters, maybe Oreos, right? Something like that. So it might be easy if you have a factory, you have all this machinery in place, you can just kind of adjust a few things and switch into a different market. That might not be a problem. But if you're a gas station, you are a gas station, right? I know we've been using the example of like food, selling food to people, but that's not a real solution. If you're a gas station, there's pretty much one thing you can do, and it's gas, right? And so when the price of gas goes way down, you don't really have a lot you can do, right? So if it is easy to enter and exit the market, right, price elasticity is elastic, right? You can easily move your way out of a market or into a market if it's starting to make a heavy profit. If it is hard to enter and exit a market, you're going to see a lot more inelasticity, right? They're not going to be nearly, they're not going to move nearly as quickly based on a price change. Okay. The second one is going to be scarce resources. Okay. So what this means This one's pretty simple. If there is scarcity, if a scarce resource, so let me back up. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. So almost all goods take a resource to produce it, right? Input, produce, right? So this is about the inputs used. Let me do the parentheses because I did it up there. Inputs used to produce a good, right? And that can be something like labor, right? So like if I'm making a website, right? What do I need? I need a web client, and I need time, right, to make a website, right? And maybe coding. But that's just labor, right? That's human capital, which we'll talk about later, right? If I'm owning a gas station, that requires oil, right? That requires metal, that require to make the gas station machines, right? It requires labor, a cashier, right? It requires somebody to help with upkeep, right? So if the resources that you're using is scarce, right? Then you're going to be pretty inelastic, right? You're going to have to, it's going to be really tough for you to move out of that market if the price of those, if the scarce resources kind of vanish, right? So the example they use is beachfront property, right? So the idea is that um, if you are a supplier of beachfront vacation homes, right? Um, if you supply beachfront homes, right, then your market is determined by how much beachfront property there is, right? So because of that, you're even if the price for people to rent or purchase a beachfront property goes down, you're still stuck in that market, right? You're not going to turn your beachfront properties into non-beachfront properties, right? Where the price might be higher. That's not how that's gonna work, right? Um, again, same with gasoline, right? If you are um, uh, uh, you know you're not going to be able to switch to another scarce resource and stuff like that. If not scarce, again, if you're like running a website, right, running a website or like creating a website, I can do that in 2 seconds. It just takes some time. That's almost infinite. Now, scarce here is interesting because if we go back to fundamental economic concepts, everything is scarce, but just for this example, it's almost really a shortage, right? And the last one is the same as the last one over there, time horizon. All right, again, so if the time horizon is short and there's a sudden price drop in a market, you're not moving, right? But if it's long term, you are able to change your situation, change your factory to produce a different good, change your business to sell a different good, right? And so I'm sorry I didn't do a really good job explaining the scarce resources one, but these are the 7 different things that can affect the elasticity of a good. And then here is the curve for it, right? The unit elastic, the elastic curve in the blue, the inelastic curve in yellow, right? As you can see, comparing the inelastic quantity demanded versus the elastic quantity demanded, right? The more inelastic you are, the less you are able to budge when the price of a good changes. When you're more elastic, you are able to move in and out of the market if the price of a good changes. Okay, so that's going to wrap it up for today, just because elasticity is pretty tough. We're going to come back with talking about in what ways we use elasticity, especially when it comes to revenue. We'll focus almost exclusively on that tomorrow, but it will continue to come up as well when we talk about taxes, and then also how shifts in the demand curve are impacted, right? Actually, I don't think we're going to do that. I don't think that's part of this. So come back tomorrow. We'll talk more about elasticity. Thank you guys.